Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. I'm Michael Noland. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Beatles' brand new single. Some new information has come out, and you know what? Not all of it is good. All right, so I mentioned some new information. I'm talking about Penn from Penn and Teller, his new interview where he talked about being invited, as we all have been, into Abbey Road Studios by Giles Martin himself, and was allowed to listen to the brand new Beatles single. Now, during this interview, Penn brought up several things that kind of clarify what this project is all about. First of all, we still do not know if the song is Now and Then, although most people are betting on Now and Then being the track. He goes on to talk about that the Beatles are all there. George played some guitar over the track back when they were first doing the anthology recordings, and Ringo got on board late and recorded his drums. It's interesting. At first he didn't want to do it, but evidently Giles Martin called him up and said, "You're the Beatles drummer. This is the very last time you'll ever be invited to drum on a Beatles track." And Ringo submitted and finally said, "All right, I'll record it at my home studio, and that's how we'll do it." But all of the Beatles are there. There's John, there's Paul, sort of, and there's Ringo and George, sort of. We'll talk about that as we go along. Now, one of the things that Penn noted was that when he was listening to the spectrum of John and Paul's voice, that instead of the sound of them singing around one microphone and harmonizing, we get them standing about a foot apart. I think that that's just because that's the way most people mix their albums now, and they're trying to get a more contemporary sound. There's nothing wrong with that. Like I said, they did a lot of that in the remix of Revolver, and as you guys know, I consider that a wonderful remix. So I'm not against remixing. He goes on to say that there is an orchestra as well as some brass, Paul's bass, what George recorded back in the day along with Ringo's new drumming, and Paul's new vocal. Now, as most of you know, I've mentioned this many times, Paul's voice, his vocal range is nowhere near what it used to be. And evidently, they've done a Michael Douglas on this guy. Remember the movie Ant-Man? We got a Michael Douglas that looked closer to what he looked like on the streets of San Francisco, you know, from the 70s, that TV show, than what he actually looked like for the rest of the movie. Now, that's fine. It's a movie based on a comic book, so anything goes for something like that in order to tell a story. But the Beatles are not just merely a story. They were an actual fact, and they're no longer around. I think it's a little late in the game to be changing Paul's voice to sound younger. They're de-aging Paul. Now, how far back does this de-aging go? After all, they're also going to use a snippet from the song Because from John Lennon from the Abbey Road album. There, we've got John, Paul, and George singing in harmony, and they're all in their 20s. And John's vocal, unless they've de-aged him as well, we get a close to 40-year-old John. Of course, Paul, now in his 80s, will have a different vocal timbre. And so they're saying that they've, well, essentially de-aged his voice for that specific reason. For what specific reason would be my question. You know, this project is starting to look like a project that has no real identity. Last year we got Revolver, the remix. A lot of us were hoping we'd get the Rubber Soul remix this year. I was praying to God they weren't going to include this song on that. That would be a disaster in my opinion. But in this interview, Penn goes on to say, no, they're actually going to remix the Red and the Blue album. Two albums that, as far as I'm concerned, shouldn't even exist. So what's their plan? Have they already remixed the Red and the Blue album and this will show up as a bonus track on that? Better that than on Rubber Soul. And the whole idea that they are flying in their vocals from the Abbey Road album sounds more like The Love Project. Do you see what I mean? We're getting all kinds of identities attached to this project. Now, I had read in another interview that Paul actually plays the lead guitar on this track. So what George guitar is left? Is it just George strumming an acoustic guitar rhythm that he played along with the track with Paul, as he did in the Beatles, to George's annoyance, playing lead on this particular track? But Penn only was aware of Paul playing bass and an orchestra and some brass being added. Now, here's the thing about de-aging his voice. This, to me, is true AI, folks. This isn't isolating John's voice and eliminating the TV in the background. This is 80-year-old plus Paul singing along with a 40-year-old John, as well as their 20-somethings vocals. All right, do you see what I'm talking about here? But here's also the problem. There's a raspiness to Paul's voice. If they're going to de-age him, they're going to have to get out of that. And when they do that through computer, that is essentially changing the recording. To me, that is no longer truly Paul's voice. You know, I've watched these videos on YouTube. You know, John Lennon and Paul McCartney sing Don't Go Breaking My Heart or whatever, you know, and I hate those things. And to me, it is the death of creativity in the music industry, and we need to shut that crap down now. But really, what is this track all about? They could also remix Love and stick this track on it because it has the flyovers from Abbey Road. See what I mean? This track, as a Beatle track, has no real identity. We could always tell the differences between songs written, say, for the Help album, then a progression to Rubber Soul, then Revolver, and finally, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, leading up to Abbey Road. Each and every individual album got better and better or more progressive as the Beatles went along. Here we see them going back to moments in time in the past with the Beatles, moments in time when the Beatles were broken up and barely speaking to each other, to moments in time when the Beatles got together and did Real Love, right? And the other John Lennon track off the anthology album, and George not exactly liking the whole process. And then we're up to a time where Paul McCartney just couldn't leave this song alone. I've talked about that in the past. I always knew he'd get his hands on this, and I am still curious about this song and how it will sound. But you know what, Penn? To me, this is just too many damn rabbits being pulled out of the hat. And you know what? He goes on to say that him and Giles were actually talking about the quality of the song, whether it's good or bad, and somebody interrupted them and said, "It's the damn Beatles' next single." All right? Now, he didn't say whether they were saying the song was good or bad, but evidently some sort of criticism must have been harbored for that other individual to insert his big mouth into the conversation. So in the end, what do we get? Well, we get a de-aged Paul, possibly a de-aged John, I don't know. Non-de-aged John, Paul, and George from the Abbey Road album. Paul playing bass at 80, George playing guitar in his 50s, John singing in his near 40s, along with them singing in their 20s. I mean, this sounds like wishful thinking and wings on a prayer. What do you guys think about this? Is this really a Beatles single? Is this really even the Beatles? Of course I'm interested in the recording. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were the greatest songwriters and the greatest composers of the 20th century, as far as I'm concerned. And even in their sleep, could outright any of their contemporaries. All right, I hope you enjoyed the video tonight. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. That helps channel growth and all that. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel as of yet, that's easy. All you have to do, here it comes, is hit that subscribe to the tribe button, then tap that top bell icon and you'll be notified of all my future videos. All right, I'm Michael Noland. This is The Bottom Line. Again, only as I see it, folks. But together, you and I, in the comments, we become a tribe. We are the tribe. And I'll see you in my next video.